How's the sound level? Is that about right? Good. Welcome to the City Club Evening Conversation Series. The first thing I'd like to do is to thank the Osher Institute for providing this wonderful room, and to Dana Thorpe Patterson, the director, who will be in momentarily, and Laura Melhoff is our technical support group. So thank you. These conversations, we started them a couple of years ago. We started them called evening conversations, and they were generally conversations between people on different sides of controversial issues. And we had them in small groups so people could be, oh, yes, doesn't do a damn bit of good down. So there were controversial issues between people on different sides of the issue. And we decided that we liked the small group format where people can be part of the conversation so well that we're going to expand that out in some other topics. So usually topics of see, I had a note here, what kind of topics? Okay, historical and civil import. When I'll introduce Dr. Crone here in a moment. We will take a break at about halfway through. Dr. Crone will speak for about 45 minutes. We'll take a break, and after that, then we'll open up the conversation so people can join in, ask questions, make comments, and again, generally just become part of the conversation. For those of you who are listening from home, we will be taking your questions, and as we have time, we will address those as well. So remember to turn your phones off. Restrooms are outside, and across the hall is the men's room, and down the hall is the ladies' room. They're on either side of that entry hallway. This evening, we're going to be talking about the election of 1876 and the subsequent end of Reconstruction. Should I be in a different spot? Probably not. I'm probably okay. Which that was one of the most consequential elections in our history, and the beginning of a very dark chapter in our history. Dr. Raymond James Crone will spend the first half, well, I've already said that. Dr. Crone received his BA in art history from John Carroll University, completed an MA at Youngstown State University, and received his PhD in history from Purdue in 2010. He looks a lot younger than he really is. So he focused on 19th century. I haven't spoken for a while in front of people, so give me a break. He focused on 19th century U.S. history and worked closely with the various period specialists. Dr. Crone joined the Department of History at Boise State in 2012. His teaching and research interests encompass 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, specifically histories of slavery, abolitionism, and social reform movements, as well as constitutional, political, intellectual, and cultural history. In his bio on the BSU History website, he states that, as an educator, I seek to demonstrate to students why the past matters. My overriding goal is to convey the complexity of history, engaging in unpacking the what's, how's, and why's of the past, and on their own terms for their own sake. How the past shapes the present, to the extent which past itself and the study of the past are vibrant, dynamic, and ever relevant. So please hold your questions till the break. Dr. Crone will address them then. Dr. Crone.
Do I need to press anything? Obviously not. Thank you for that introduction. Good evening, everyone. I appreciate your attendance, but let's get down to business. Tonight, I have a difficult assignment: how to effectively explain and contextualize one of the most controversial and consequential contests in American presidential history. Yet, As I reflected on the election of 1876 in preparation for this event and pondered its place within the Reconstruction era, my thoughts continually revolved about images and instances of violence, right? Violence destabilized and upended interracial politics throughout the ex-Confederacy by early 1877. Violence, by the way, not only precipitated the demise of the Republican Party's Southern Rebuilding Project, it also accompanied the rise of a New South system of white mastery, black subordination beginning in the 1890s. If indeed the 4-year Civil War amounted to a second American Revolution, which completed the libertarian work that the first one had left unfinished, then the less popularly remembered post-war struggle was an even longer second Civil War. This evening, I would like to address the war after the war, as well as consider how the election of 1876 marked the end of an age. First, some observations on the Civil War as a second American Revolution. As a result of the Civil War, the single most valuable commodity in the United States lost its monetary value. In 1860, the enslaved populations of the American South numbered approximately 4 million. As chattels personal or movable pieces of property, those 4 million bond servants totaled between $3.5 to $4 billion at the time, not in ours. Nothing else in the United States economically rivaled those 4 million bond servants. Not even the collective worth of the country's banks, railroads, and manufacturers. What many of those 4 million bond servants principally produced, cotton, only enhanced their centrality in the world that these slaveholders had made. The Old South's annual cotton crop comprised America's most lucrative export, more precious than all the country's exports combined. Precisely because slaves constituted profitable commodities and cultivated profitable commodities. Slavery itself, in a phrase, was too big to fail. Still, human enslavement's significance transcended the purely financial or commercial. Due to state laws, the systematic oppression of an entire race of people rendered all whites masterful by default. Regardless of how many Southern white families held slaves at any given moment, virtually all white Southerners benefited from a race-based regime of perpetual servitude. In other words, since only blacks were enslavable, all whites, namely adult white males, were free, equal, and independent in the political terms. Since only blacks were enslavable, all whites, the rich and the poor, the landed and the landless, the educated and the uneducated, were racially superior. Ironically, the very slaveholders' rebellion that sought to preserve human enslavement actually made the destruction of perpetual bondage possible. This is not the occasion to unpack that comment. All that matters is that an escalating civil war eventually uprooted an otherwise entrenched and invaluable Southern system of slavery. The dramatic changes that attended devastating combat further revolutionized the Southland in particular. By the late 1860s, the formerly enslaved, specifically the freedmen, equaled ex-slave holders in crucial regards. One should not, therefore, dismiss the radicalism of Reconstruction era congressional enactments and constitutional amendments. Among Western Hemisphere regions where human enslavement disappeared during the 19th century, only the United States, to my knowledge, granted emancipated slaves the same civil and political rights as their previous masters. Even if that statement is inaccurate, the overarching point is pertinent and powerful. For the earthly gains of the formerly enslaved were absolutely hellish for white racial conservatives across the American South. Simply keep in mind the following. Union forces undoubtedly defeated Confederate armies on the battlefield, but countless ex-Confederates were unvanquished. They consequently resented and resisted any and all positive advancements in race relations. In so doing, they carried out a reactionary revolution by the late 1870s and beyond. Whatever the innocent origins of the Ku Klux Klan in late 1865, it quickly emerged as a region-wide weapon in a new post-war fight. Organized and operated locally, the KKK comprised a grassroots movement that received the backing of whites from all socio-economic classes. First wave terrorism consisting of the Klan and such kindred groups as the Knights of the White Camellia, the White Brotherhood, the Pale Faces, the Invisible Empire, the Knights of the Black Cross, and so on. Despite the Klan's decentralized nature, operatives across the South shared a common objective and pursued similar tactics. Hooded Klansmen generally dressed in ghost-like costumes so as to disguise their identities and frighten supposedly superstitious ex-slaves. Hooded Klansmen often, but not always, launched nighttime offensives. Hooded Klansmen unleashed waves of terror, especially during election cycles, in order to achieve the following: to intimidate Black voters and office holders, to sap popular support for the Republican Party, and sabotage congressional reconstruction, to revive white democratic rule and subject African Americans to a slave-like status, to resurrect the world that seemingly ended during the First Civil War. To demonstrate Klan ferocity, cruelty, and criminality, consider how operatives sought to achieve core aims during the election of 1868. In Louisiana, for example, politically driven violence produced nearly 1,000 deaths. In Arkansas, to give another example, politically driven violence resulted in the assassination of more than 200 Republicans and possibly some 2,000 murders altogether. In both the Louisiana and Arkansas scenarios, election year Klan depredations disproportionately affected African Americans. Overall, due to Klan activities, the electoral votes of the ex-Confederate states of Georgia and Louisiana went to the Democratic presidential candidate Horatio Seymour. KKK also suppressed Black voter turnout elsewhere. in the former Confederacy, namely Tennessee, South Carolina, and Alabama. Excuse me one moment. In 1868, however, Klan terrorists had failed to create a solid South on behalf of the Democratic Party. Regardless of geographical section, though, Democrats openly appealed to the anti-Black prejudices of white voters in their efforts to unseat Republicans nationwide. Their party's platform called for, quote, the abolition of the Freedmen's Bureau, designed to oversee the African-American transition from slavery to freedom. And all political instrumentalities designed to secure Negro supremacy, end quote. Their party's vice presidential nominee, Francis Preston Blair Jr. of Missouri, issued unabashedly racist pronouncements. During a public speech, Seymour's running mate charged Republicans with placing the Southland under the dominion of a, quote, semi-barbarous race of people, all of whom Blair proclaimed are worshipers of fetishes and polygamists, and whose men long, quote, to subject the white women to their unbridled lust, end quote. In a letter that the New York Times printed, then a Democratic press, a newspaper in support of the Democratic Party, Seymour's running mate asserted that white Southerners would not, quote, patiently endure the black iron yoke of political bondage enforced by bayonets, end quote. He additionally claimed that African-American voting rights would constantly inflame, predicting that the matter, quote, will never cease to rankle the entire country until it is eradicated. Thus, in the first presidential contest in which the freedmen could officially participate, many courageously risked their lives in order to vote for the Republican nominee for the presidency, the Union war hero Ulysses S. Grant. Since only some 300,000 popular votes separated the two contestants, arguably, Black votes in the South provided Grant with that majority cushion. African Americans endured not only the physical violence that hooded Klansmen and other terrorists had unloaded, but also the verbal attacks hurled at them by bigoted whites in the North and the South. I want to return to this one quotation at the very end. Not for the last time would a prominent white figure allege that sexually aggressive and uncontrollable Black men desired white women, stoking prejudicial fears that they, Black men, would marry them, white women, if they could, or rape them if they must. Due to vigorous actions by the US government itself, a major topic under the 1870-1871 Enforcement Acts, the KKK counter-revolution largely disintegrated, thereby making the election of 1872 into a relatively peaceful affair. Arguably, another fair election did not occur in the former Confederacy until later in the 20th century. Paramilitary operations nevertheless resumed in parts of the former Confederacy shortly after Grant's easy presidential reelection. During the next phase of racially motivated violence, white perpetrators no longer concealed themselves behind masks or under the cover of darkness. Indeed, they dispensed with costume disguises and brazenly launched attacks in broad daylight, as if testing US governmental officials and daring them to intervene. After 1872, racial violence and the Democratic Party were explicitly aligned, whereas before the two were more loosely connected. As the militant wing of the Southern Democratic Party's second wave terrorists also went by different names in different states, such as White Leagues, Rifle Clubs, and Red Shirts. Regardless of the nom de guerre, the universal ambition of all such groups encompassed the total demoralization of Blacks, the total subversion of local Republican rule, and the total restoration of the democracy that is how Democrats referred to their partisan organization, the democracy, to restore Democratic whites to political power. After 1872, moreover, the Southern Democratic Party boldly appealed to white supremacy and the recent Confederate past. As signs of the changing times, Democratic rallies by the mid-1870s commonly featured political candidates flanked by veteran soldiers clad in gray uniforms. Once the rallies had formally concluded, white mobs often continued the proceedings by attacking, harassing nearby Black communities and office holders. Keep in mind that by overwhelmingly supporting the party of Lincoln and emancipation, the freedmen consistently committed acts of independence that frustrated white racial conservatives. So widely did African Americans identify as Republicans that white Democrats in the South contemptuously branded the partisan organization as the N-words party. Having failed to politically manage or manipulate the former slaves, white racial conservatives bitterly dismissed Republican regimes as a foreign and tyrannical intrusion from without, ones imposed by white Northerners in the US government and their carpetbagger emissaries who had ventured southwards during and after the Civil War. Again, having failed to politically manage or manipulate former slaves, white racial conservatives bitterly dismissed Black suffrage and office holding as alien and sinister forces from within, made possible by intrusive and tyrannical white Northerners in the US government and their carpetbagger emissaries who had ventured southwards during and after the Civil War. Regardless of the terrorist phase, white racial conservatives ultimately branded themselves as regional redeemers. They would cleanse themselves and their entire section from Republican corruption and misrule. The road to redemption forever blocked Reconstruction. Get to that in a moment. With the assistance of white supremacist vigilantes, Democratic political power returned to the entire ex-Confederate South by early 1877. In 1875, however, if you look closely at this map, in 1875, Republicans still presided over the gubernatorial office and/or legislature in 4 deep South states: Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. To overthrow Republican governance, Mississippi Democrats established a model that neighboring whites quickly imitated. Enter the Mississippi Plan or shotgun policy. Under the plan, under the policy, Democrats pursued two strategies in their quest to win state elections in 1875. Firstly, Mississippi Democrats pressured white Republicans to switch partisan sides by socially ostracizing and or physically threatening them. Secondly, Mississippi Democrats let loose a much more intimidating and vicious campaign against Black Republicans who made up the bulk of the state's Republican Party. It is a well-known fact, according to the straightforward appraisal of a leading Black Republican, John Roy Lynch, that nearly every Democratic club in the state was converted into an armed military company. Via Democratic rifle clubs, white racial conservatives regularly disrupted African American political gatherings, provoked confrontations, and opened fire without warning. In Vicksburg alone, white racial conservatives killed 300 African Americans in late 1874. To illustrate the electoral impact of the shotgun policy, consider the following. In 1873, the Republican gubernatorial candidate received 1,800 more votes than the Democratic counterpart in Yazoo County. In 1875, however, the Democrats routed their opponents in the same Black Belt region by a vote of 4,044 to 7. More generally, whereas the Republicans had previously earned a 30,000 vote advantage statewide, the Democrats, under the new plan, the new policy, acquired their own 30,000 vote majority, a net gain of some 60,000 votes in a state where African Americans comprised 55% of the population. Such a turnaround was truly astounding and all the more illegitimate. The method of the Mississippians especially inspired white South Carolinians. In the lead up to the election of 1876, shooting clubs proliferated throughout the Palmetto State. Often called red shirts, militaristic groups in South Carolina numbered 213, according to one contemporaneous estimate, with a minimum membership of 13,000. In the latter-day calculations of historians, though, the armed red shirts amounted to about 30,000 in 1876. Particularly revealing and representative are the sentiments of former Confederate General Martin Witherspoon Gary. To prevail against the state's sizable Black populations, Gary privately circulated multi-point campaign plans to fellow clubmen, in which he set forth the occasionally fair but mainly foul means to politically restore the Democrats. I want to highlight some of those points. Point 12. Stressed that every Democrat must feel honor-bound to control the vote of at least one Negro by intimidation, purchase, keeping him away, or as each individual may determine how he may best accomplish it. Point 14 emphasized that in speeches to Negroes, you must remember that argument has no effect upon them. They can only be influenced by their fears, superstition, and cupidity. Do not attempt to flatter and persuade them. Prove to them that we can carry the election without them, and if they cooperate with us, it will benefit them more than it will us. Treat them so as to show them you are the superior race and that their natural position is that of subordination to the white man. 3 more. Point 16 underscored that never threaten a man individually if he deserves to be threatened. The necessities of the times require that he should die. A dead radical is very harmless. A threatened radical, or one driven off by threats, is often very troublesome, sometimes dangerous, always vindictive. Point 25 demanded that the watchword of our campaign should be fight the devil with fire. We are in favor of local self-government, home rule by home folks, and that we are determined to drive the carpetbaggers from this state at all hazards. Another campaign slogan, Hampton or hell. Point number 30 insisted that secrecy should shroud all of our transactions. Let not your left hand know what your right hand does. In 1876, armed red shirts actively campaigned alongside the Democratic gubernatorial candidate and ex-Confederate military commander Wade Hampton. In early 1877, the red shirts supported Hampton, formally assumed the governorship of South Carolina, but only after a new Republican president recognized the Democrats' victory. As the election of 1876 approached, disenchantment with a Southern rebuilding project had already taken hold among Northern Republicans, many of whom reconciled themselves to Democratic home rule. When President Grant deployed U.S. troops in Louisiana in order to check an unlawful Democratic takeover after a divisive 1874 election, the military's presence on state house floors spawned consternation and condemnation in the North among members of the chief executive's party. Carl Schurz of Missouri provocatively captured a deteriorating Republican stance towards Reconstruction in a speech before the U.S. Senate. If this can be done in Louisiana, he opined, how long will it be before it can be done in Massachusetts and in Ohio? How long before the constitutional rights of all the states and the self-government of all the people may be trampled underfoot? How long before a general of the army may sit in the chair you occupy, sir, to decide contested election cases for the purposes of manufacturing a majority in the Senate? How long before a soldier may stalk into the National House of Representatives and pointing to the speakers may say, take away that bauble? When Governor Ames requested that the U.S. government intercede in Mississippi to stop the Rifle Club onslaught, the Grant administration ultimately withheld assistance. The whole public, according to the often quoted words of Grant's Attorney General, are tired out with these annual autumnal outbreaks in the South, and the great majority are ready now to condemn any interference on the part of the government. Preserve the peace by the forces in your own state, and let the country see that the citizens of Mississippi, who are largely Republican, have the courage to fight for their rights. as the election of 1876 approached. Many leading Republicans essentially decided that the party could no longer uphold equal Black rights in the South and maintain its electoral viability nationally. Even though persistently violent Southern white opposition to interracial politics certainly required the continuous involvement of the US government in the region's race relations, by the mid-1870s, such intervention amounted to a serious political liability. Besides the evidently unshakable resistance of white racial conservatives, the Panic of 1873, which initiated a decade-long depression, contributed to increasingly more Northern Republicans distancing themselves from Reconstruction. Right, since the Panic of 1873 pushed financial matters, labor issues, and economic recovery to the forefront of political agendas, it also helped to facilitate Reconstruction's collapse. As evidence of the changes that the downturn had wrought, consider one revealing fact. In the 1874 congressional elections, the Democrats overcame a seemingly insurmountable 110 Republican seat majority in the House of Representatives. Voter discontent therefore enabled the Democrats to gain control of the lower chamber for the first time in nearly 20 years. The national resurgence of Democratic partisans dedicated to states' rights and white supremacy, in tandem with palpable disillusionment with Reconstruction in the North, meant that interested Republicans could no longer safeguard the formerly enslaved and their descendants. Just 1876 election year editorial cartoons, right? Tilden or Blood. The party of Lincoln and emancipation nevertheless paid lip service to the freed people. The Republican Party platform of 1876, for instance, vowed that the organizational membership remained committed to the, quote, permanent pacification of the southern section of the Union and the complete protection of all its citizens in the free enjoyment of their rights, end quote. It additionally asserted that the U.S. government's legislative and executive branches possessed, quote, a solemn obligation to put into immediate and vigorous exercise all their constitutional powers for removing any just causes of discontent on the part of any class and securing to every American citizen complete liberty and exact equality in the exercise of all civil, political, and public rights. In a July 1876 letter accepting the Republican presidential nomination, Rutherford B. Hayes also echoed the party platform. Before the communication closed, the three-time Ohio governor declared, quote, the condition of the southern states attracts the attention and commands the sympathy of the people of the whole Union. In their progressive recovery from the effects of the war, their first necessity is an intelligent and honest administration of the government, which will protect all classes of citizens and all their political and private rights. There can be no enduring peace if the constitutional rights of any portion of the people are habitually disregarded. Interesting language. That Hayes prefaced his equal rights rhetoric with references to governmental honesty and intelligence, signaled something special to ostensibly reform-minded individuals of all partisan persuasions and sectional identities. Should the Ohioan become president of the United States? Unpacking the communication. His administration would take a hands-off approach to the ex-Confederate states. Thus, when Hayes finally entered the executive mansion, the new president compromised on nothing when he ordered that U.S. troops in Louisiana and South Carolina withdraw to their respective barracks and cease defending local Republican claims to the governorship and state house. In other words, after a 15-person electoral commission decided that the disputed returns of 3 Deep South states rightfully belonged to the Republican presidential candidate, the incoming chief executive achieved what he had always set out to do: recognition of Southern home rule. In hindsight, the election of 1876 marked a turning point in U.S. history. Its outcome symbolically sounded Reconstruction's death knell. Of course, evocative book titles. Of course, a new South system of white mastery, black subordination did not immediately take shape. Not until the 1890s did racial segregation and disenfranchisement begin to emerge as facts of life and law throughout the former Confederacy. Some disturbing images to follow, just a warning. As that Jim Crow order materialized, white Southerners engaged in another phase of ritualized sadistic violence, lynching scores of African Americans annually. Between 1880 and 1930, lynch mobs executed more than 3,300 African Americans in the South, compared to roughly 700 whites. Allegedly in protection of white womanhood, Southern lynch mobs murdered Black men predominantly and for reasons that had nothing to do with sexual assault. Even before violence ushered in and reinforced the neo-slavery of the 1890s and beyond, its ugly head reared time and again as masked and unmasked vigilantes shed blood across the Southland. The Reconstruction era death toll, according to scholarly assessments, ranges from 12 to 20,000. Yet for Robert Smalls of South Carolina, the numbers were far higher. The carnage was far worse. The prominent Black Republican left office as a U.S. congressman in early 1887. He determined that 53,000 African Americans had been murdered since emancipation. Even though the Second Civil War was not as deadly as the first, the war after the war was lethal nonetheless. I have a few more slides, but I think that takes up my time, does it not? Yeah. A few slides just to encapsulate the radicalness of the Reconstruction era. How revolutionary, albeit short-lived, interracial politics and power sharing was for some 10 years. This just encapsulates everything I've sought to demonstrate. The role of white racial violence in the destruction of Reconstruction, the war after the war. You've already seen this slide. Boy, oh boy. Right, due to the Reconstruction Acts of 1866 and 1867, 1867 and 1868, African American men not only cast votes for the first time throughout the South, they also held public office at all levels of government. The earthly gains, if you remember what I said earlier, the earthly gains of African Americans in the South, absolutely hellish for white racial conservatives. During the Reconstruction era, more generally, as many as 1,500 African Americans held elected or appointed office at the local, state, and national levels. This just gives you a sense at some of the local level positions that African Americans held. Mayors, city and town councilmen, county commissioners, sheriffs, deputy sheriffs, police officers, constables, jailers, wardens, and so on. At the state level, during the Reconstruction era, 9 African Americans served as secretaries of state, 6 served as lieutenant governors, 4 served as superintendents of instruction, education, 2 served as treasurers, 1 served as a Supreme Court justice at the state level. At the national level, the Reconstruction era revolution, by the way, was not limited to the former Confederacy. The 15th Amendment enfranchised adult African American men throughout the United States. In the former slaveholding and non-slaveholding states alike. At the national level, during the Reconstruction era, 16 African Americans served in the U.S. Congress. Of those 16 Black congressmen, 14 served as U.S. representatives, 2 others as U.S. senators, both from Mississippi. And some notable Black congressmen. I already mentioned in passing Robert Spall's name, as well as John Roy Lynch, for instance. Think about this. Whereas 2 African Americans served as U.S. senators during the Reconstruction era, only 2 others subsequently did so over the entire 20th century. The earthly gains of African Americans constituted a hellish turn of events for white racial conservatives. And that is my last slide. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
I actually have 2 questions, and never know how to phrase it properly, but I understand that the South went from loss of income, economic troubles. How did it morph into just being this hatred and wanting to be supreme? That's the first one. And the
Let's start there.
Okay.
So the comment question revolves about an understanding of slavery's economic importance. But from what I gather, the question gets at the heart of why this notion of white supremacy. What I sought to demonstrate in passing is that white supremacy preceded the Civil War and Reconstruction. It's very crucial to think about the ramifications, the long-term ramifications of a race-based system of servitude. Only Blacks were enslavable. What did that mean for all whites in political terms? By 1840, a remarkable democratization development in US history, by the way. By 1840, universal white manhood suffrage was a virtual reality in the United States, as 95% of adult white males possessed voting rights, an important democratization development. This is a very complex question, and I'm jumping around in some respects because so many ideas are circulating in my head. The significance of skin color, what skin color signified. Even 17th century colonial Virginians, for much of the 1600s, Virginia tobacco planters relied on contract laborers from Europe, indentured servants, increasingly in the later 1600s and more exclusively in the early 1700s. Tobacco cultivators in the Chesapeake, Maryland, and Virginia depended on enslaved laborers from Africa. Even Virginia colonists recognized the power of skin color by the later 1600s. Lightness and freedom, darkness and slavery. The fact that only Africans in the New World and their descendants were enslavable meant, at minimum, in the United States, all white males were free and independent. As I emphasize in many of my classes, white Americans shared similar anti-Black prejudices in the non-slaveholding North and the slaveholding South. I'm a scholar of slavery in part, but primarily of abolitionism. Many an anti-slavery activist after 1830 routinely fielded a challenge from an anti-abolitionist along the lines of, would you allow your white daughter to marry an N-word? I don't know if I've fully answered your question, but more than anything else, right, the power of skin color and what skin color signified in the United States, where only Africans and their descendants were enslavable. And your second question.
I always mix up his name, but Lincoln's vice president who took over, Andrew
Johnson, another Tennessean.
Yeah. I mean, he just allowed everything to go to hell. And he promoted it. If we had had somebody different, I think things would have been a lot different.
That's an interesting problem, too. It's a counterfactual. What would have happened if Abraham Lincoln had persisted? That is, if he had not been assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. By the way, towards the end of his life, and one of Lincoln's final public statements, he openly supported limited voting rights for African American men. John Wilkes Booth was in attendance. He said, that's it. That means N-word power. By God, I'll put him in. Right? Lincoln and Johnson, in some respects, profoundly similar. 19th century, Western world, heroicize the self-made individual. Lincoln and Johnson, autodidacts, self-educated, from white trash to the White House. White trash is a 19th century term. What would have happened had Lincoln lived and Johnson never become president of the United States? I want to flip that on its head. I think that Andrew Johnson is the best, worst president in United States history. Because without Johnson, no 14th Amendment, no 15th Amendment. The silver lining in Reconstruction's death, if there is a silver lining, is that the revolutionary Reconstruction amendments remained on the books, right? Not nullified. So counterfactuals are always stimulating. I don't know if Lincoln was always far more pragmatic than Johnson. Johnson was himself a pre-war states' rights Democrat. He remained loyal to the Union amidst secessionism and, of course, during the War of the Rebellion, the Civil War. Johnson, the Tennessean, held on to his Senate seat, rewarded by the Republican Party. During the Civil War, military governor of Tennessee, Lincoln's vice presidential running mate. In 1864, the Republican Party no longer existed. There was the National Union Party. Lincoln of Illinois, the Republican. Johnson of Tennessee, the Democrat, the National Union Party. No one anticipated that Andrew Johnson would succeed Abraham Lincoln. Other questions or comments?
Yeah, from the audience, from the online audience, someone was asked, please describe the election of 1876 and the resulting compromise.
So one of the Zoomers, as I like to call remote attendees, wants to know more about the results of the election of 1876 and the compromise. Well, the results are fairly straightforward. To this day, it remains a controversial contest. To this day, I suspect no historian can accurately calculate how much fraud took place. The disputed returns, 3 deep South states still under control by Republicans, Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida. I explicitly avoided the so-called Compromise of 1877 because I and many historians firmly contend that such a compromise never occurred. Allegedly, in the standoff between Tilden supporters and Hayes backers, friends of the president and other Democratic congressmen convened behind closed doors, Wormley's Hotel, and hashed out a compromise that would remove Democratic opposition to official certification of the Electoral Commission findings in the House of Representatives. Rather than filibuster, rather than delay, Democrats supposedly agreed to a Hayes presidency in exchange for governmental support of a southern-oriented railroad that would reach the Pacific, another transcontinental, in exchange for some patronage positions, a southerner in the president's cabinet, in exchange for Hayes withdrawing U.S. troops from South Carolina, Louisiana state houses, ordering them to retreat to their respective barracks, and so on. And the classic iconic study of the supposed compromise of 1877 is from, I can't exactly recall the publication date, C. Van Woodward, The Compromise of 1877. Regardless of some supposed backroom compromising, Hayes already stated in his acceptance letter that he was committed to equal rights, but also honest and intelligent government. Signal, 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 signal. Local self-government, home rule, home rule. Hayes conceded nothing when he eventually withdrew U.S. troops from the state houses in Louisiana and South Carolina and ordered them to withdraw to their respective barracks. Southern Democrats could care less in many respects for a New Yorker Tilden presidency. They got what they wanted. Home rule. So, Zoomer, that's how I'm going to respond to your question. I hope that's helpful. Other questions or comments, please.
from the virtual audience again, do you see any parallels between the period that spawned violent suppression of voting for some and Jim Crow laws and today's efforts to pass laws making it more difficult to vote under the guise of combating voter fraud?
Effectively, this question concerns parallels between discriminatory Jim Crow statutes of the 1890s, early 20th century, and new attempts throughout parts of the United States to restrict voter access. Well, Zoomer, I'm a little tongue-tied because I'm paid to think about the past. I'm paid to think about the past. I am a past-oriented individual. I say that jokingly and seriously. As I tell my students, it's so much more rewarding to be a historian of the past than a citizen in the present. As a historian, I can better understand the past than I can comprehend the present. As a historian, I have access to the necessary information. As a citizen, I have to sift through information and misinformation. I have no access to official documents, since many of those things will not be publicly available for decades. So I'm trying to skirt the question, if you can tell. And I don't know really how to answer it. I'm going to subconsciously continually think about it for as long as people ask questions. What about the Zoomer? Does the Zoomer want to weigh in on that? You can ask a question, you can make a comment. One could undoubtedly say that there are parallels. How much farther should we go, right? Other questions or comments? Not a very satisfactory answer, I suspect, so I apologize.
I think you're avoiding the question.
I was avoiding the question. I'm not running for office, but boy, oh boy, did I feel like a politician.
What was the question?
Well, parallels between Jim Crow era segregation, disenfranchisement, discriminatory laws of the Jim Crow age to new attempts throughout certain parts of the United States to restrict voter access to the ballot on behalf of fair elections against supposedly widespread fraud. I'm going to play the politician for now.
Dr. Trump, going back to the first question about the election of 1876 and the resultant compromise, did I understand you to say that a lot of historians don't believe that there was such a compromise? Because my understanding has always been that Hayes traded withdrawing troops from the South in exchange for those three states granting him their 20 electoral votes. And effectively making him president instead of Tilden, even though Tilden had won the majority of the popular vote.
Mm-hmm.
Is that not
Darwin? So Darwin's referring to that first question. We're still thinking about the results of the election of 1876 and the ostensibly resulting compromise that ensured a Hayes presidency. I'm trying to recall one electoral fact from South Carolina. The statement will not be entirely factual, but the spirit is truthful. How about that? In one South Carolina county, boy, oh boy, I know I'm going to misstate this. In one South Carolina county, Democrats received more votes than registered voters. It's not entirely accurate. It's not, and I should have included that in my presentation.
That still goes on today.
But so again, those returns. The fact that Republicans in the Congress agreed to a special electoral commission, the Electoral Commission Act, was itself a compromise designed to legitimize a future Hayes presidency. The Electoral Commission Act appointed a 15-person committee, 5 representatives, 5 senators, 5 Supreme Court justices, 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats overall. In each case, Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, members of the Electoral Commission voted 8-7 on behalf of the Republican Hayes. Republican office holders controlled the state returning boards. Democrats effectively established shadow governments throughout the 1870s, contesting lawful Republican office holders. Overlapping returns from returning boards. What should members of the Congress do? And then this compromise. Hayes appointed one democratically oriented Southerner to his cabinet, to the position of postmaster. Now, the Postal Service in the 19th century, for much of the 19th century, was the largest governmental bureaucracy in the United States. So the Postmaster General had a lot of patronage at his disposal. This is before civil service reform. Carl Schurz, the critic of Grant in the 1870s, when Grant deployed U.S. troops to prevent unlawful Democratic takeovers in Louisiana. Schurz was a civil service reformer. Liberal Republicans, as they called themselves, that is, classical liberal, laissez-faire Republicans. They wanted clean, honest, intelligent government, sometimes known as liberal Republicans, sometimes known as mugwumps, allegedly the best men. They wanted to reform the civil service, do away with the spoils system. To the victor belong the spoils of political warfare. Rather than reward the party faithful for their electoral activism with governmental jobs should be open to well-qualified candidates. So one democratically oriented Tennessean was Postmaster General. According to C. Van Woodward, the compromise also included Republicans, the party of Lincoln, emancipation, equal rights, and increasingly big business. Since states' rights Democrats from the South had withdrawn from the United States Congress, Republicans in power could realize more activist, energetic general governance, the rise of transcontinental railroads with the backing of the US government. Supposedly, Hayes agreed to support funding for another transcontinental railroad line. It never happened. So let's just say that the compromise was real. But if one were to seriously unpack the components of the compromise, very few of the agreements actually occurred. And so one of the misconceptions, though, is that Grant, outgoing President Grant, incoming President Hayes, ordered the withdrawal of troops from the South. They ordered that troops returned to their respective barracks. The troops still remained in the South. They occupied their barracks. And by the way, the US Army footprint by 1877 was quite small. 1,500 troops across the entire Southland. But that's, I can, if anyone is interested in that, I can provide some article recommendations if you want to read more into it. Other questions or comments, please.
Ray, you repeated this one phrase a few times in your talk, something about how the material realities that Reconstruction gave rise to led to sort of hellish conditions for white racial conservatives, Southern Democrats. You repeated it a few times, and it's such an interesting turn of phrase. It has explanatory power, but there's also, one could read also a little bit of empathy into it, honestly. Could you talk a little bit about that phrase and why you repeated it?
Good. The question concerns my repeating the phrase, the earthly gains of African Americans were absolutely hellish for white racial conservatives. I'm a historian of ideas. More than anything else, I study thought. I try to get inside of people's heads. At the same time, I'm a firm believer in the historian's ethics to understand the past on its own terms for its own sake. As I like to tell my students, it's easy to judge, it's difficult to understand. History is so difficult to pursue because it's an understanding undertaking. So the fine line between trying to understand the worldviews of past peoples and seemingly empathizing with the real or imagined nightmares of white racial conservatives. I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's just how I, as a historian, how I approach those very controversial things that would be far more divisive in a non-academic setting, and maybe even divisive here, right? The earthly gains of African Americans, absolutely a nightmarish scenario. What I'm trying to do is explain first, second wave terrorism, persistent white racial conservative violence. Why? What does skin color signify? Why, right? And then one of the more remarkable, if we think about what's transpiring in the present due to the Black Lives Matter movement, the toppling of Southern statuary honoring Confederate heroes. Those monuments materialize. Those monuments arose amidst the era of the neo-slavery, amidst Jim Crow, segregation, disenfranchisement, ongoing white racial conservative recalcitrance, belligerence, right? Honoring Robert E. Lee, honoring Nathan Bedford and sundry others in the 1890s, early 1900s. The South had won the Civil War. That is, for decades, the South had won the war of words. For decades, many white Northerners could care less, maybe still don't care about the very existence of statues celebrating traitors. Right? US soldiers died in the American Civil War. Right? Every office holder in the United States, from the president down to a postal clerk, had to take an oath of allegiance to the US government. One of the remarkable developments of the Civil War is that few leading Confederates lost their heads, were hanged for their traitorous actions. A little long-winded, but I hope that gets at the heart of your question. Other comments, questions?
There was follow-up from the person who asked about the parallels between the Jim Crow laws of the past and the current efforts in some states to make it more difficult. So they followed up and they said, some are saying that we're entering a new Jim Crow era. I don't know if that says too much, but I do see Lochner versus New York reasoning in a number of current Supreme Court decisions. I believe if there was a Reconstruction measuring device, today's Reconstruction would be seen as losing ground on that scale. We're continually fighting the Reconstruction battle, which is disheartening to me.
It's an ongoing struggle, right? An ongoing African-American freedom struggle. An ongoing African-American freedom struggle, without a doubt. Again, I'm hedging on that question in some respects because I'm less informed about the present than I am of the past. I'm sorry to repeat that, right? I can better understand the past and I can comprehend the present. And I just don't know how to answer that question, right? The parallels are there, right? The question is there a need for another Reconstruction? Historians often refer to the classic phase of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s as the second Reconstruction. Finally, allegedly guaranteeing the equal civil and political rights that the first one had supposedly guaranteed. Now, I offer a class called Race, Rights, and Reconstruction. For years at Boise State, I taught a Civil War class that focused on the coming, course, and consequences of that sectional military conflict. Effectively, such an approach combines 3 courses into one. More recently, I've taken Reconstruction out of the equation. My Civil War class now focuses on the coming and course of the war, Reconstruction on the war after the war. Right, we Americans still celebrate the first Civil War. Many Americans engaged in Civil War reenactments. No one, to my knowledge, popularly memorizes, popularly remembers the Second Civil War in such fashion. Maybe because for decades, white racial conservatives had won the war of words. To this very day, if I remember correctly, on the US citizenship exam, consisting of multiple choice questions. One question, this never happens in a college classroom, a multiple choice question with 2 correct answers. It doesn't happen. But on the citizenship exam, there are 2 correct answers for what caused the American Civil War, states' rights or slavery. That's white Southerners winning the war of words for generations. States' rights. The Civil War was over states' rights, not human enslavement. But that's another big topic. Other questions or comments? Darwin?
But effectively, states' rights and slavery were the same issue, were they not?
In part. At the same time, slaveholding Southerners contended that the U.S. government could not, should not, and must not interfere with slavery in the states where it existed, but it had a constitutional obligation to protect slaveholders' property rights wherever and whenever in the United States, in the non-slaveholding North and the unorganized territorial West. The U.S. government had to protect, preserve, maintain, defend chattel's person, slaveholders' property rights. So it was not merely about states' rights. Slaveholders wanted a more vigorous fugitive slave law to ensure that runaway slaves would be returned to their masters. So the slaveholders had no problems with utilizing the U.S. government on behalf of slavery, but they absolutely denied that the U.S. government had any right or responsibility to interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed. And that was a consensus, by the way, among slaveholders, non-slaveholders, abolitionists, anti-abolitionists. The consensus was that the U.S. government had no constitutional authority to abolish slavery in the individual state. That was a state right. And of course, Darwin the other point, were slavery and states' rights intertwined? To be sure. But if one argues that states' rights brought about the Civil War, my question is, then why did white Southerners only invoke states' rights? There were states' rights Democrats in the North and the South, but only states' rights Democrats in the slaveholding South pushed to take their states out of the United States. Why in 1860-61? Let's say that this is an interesting discussion. We could have that discussion, whether or not to this very day an individual state has a right to secede from the United States. But the real question is, why did individual states exercise that alleged right in 60-61? Because the anti-slavery leaning Lincoln and his election to the presidency constituted what white Southerners called an overt act, the first strike. Why wait for the Black Republican, the negative nickname for members of the Republican Party, Black Republicans? Why wait for Black Republicans to abolish slavery and equalize the races? Lincoln's very election to the presidency justified secession from the United States. Other questions or comments?
Can you speak on the Confederate flag? Because from what I understand, it wasn't even used in the Civil War.
So the Confederate battle flag was certainly, what is now considered the Confederate flag was certainly used during the Civil War, especially among Virginians, right? Regardless of which flag one uses to celebrate the Confederacy, here's a short saying to differentiate between the United States and the Confederate States. The United States entered into existence with slavery. The Confederate States entered into existence because of slavery. Distinction with the difference. Other questions, comments?
Hey, someone is asking, can you recommend some historical texts or songs that represent the resistance during this time period?
Resistance among the formerly enslaved?
I'll read the question again, but I don't know, so I'm not sure.
Oh, yes. Resistance to slavery.
Oh, shoot. Yes, okay, they're talking right now. Yes, resistance to slavery and those who were enslaved.
I'll recommend two novels from the 1890s.
Gone with the Wind?
Nope, but that's, by the way, that's Margaret Mitchell's love letter to the world that the slaveholders had made. That takes me on a different tangent, Darwin. Because much of my recent research focuses on the most socially influential novel ever authored in the United States, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Thomas Dixon penned The Leopard's Spot. He created a Klan Reconstruction trilogy when he attended a theatrical version of Uncle Tom's Cabin later in the 19th century. Uncle Tom's Cabin published in the 1850s. And if you know anything about your cinematographic history, your Hollywood history, Dixon's novels form the basis for one of the most influential films in cinematic history, Birth of a Nation. 50 years later, Margaret Mitchell wanted to do an Uncle Tom's Cabin for the slaveholders. But two novels that shed some insight onto African-American resistance to neo-slavery, if you will, to the death of Reconstruction. Charles Chestnut, The Marrow of Tradition, a fictional portrayal of a very deadly race massacre in Wilmington, North Carolina in the 1890s. And Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Iola Brown, also an 1890s novel. Iola Brown in the 1890s revisits the immediate post-Civil War years. It encapsulates the hopes, dreams, desires, ambitions of the formerly enslaved. It's a reflection on those ambitions amidst an emerging Jim Crow South. Charles Chestnut, both persons of color, Charles Chestnut, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Very effective, very powerful novels.
Dr. Crone, I think we've reached the time and we both of these people to let them go home when we promised them we would. Thank you. I appreciate very much your coming here. I'm a little concerned about your lack of enthusiasm.
Thank you. I actually tried behaving myself tonight. Right? This is mild. This is mild. Thank you for attending, folks. Thank you for your participation.
Just had my phone turned off.